Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here to correct a misconception. I don't know how widespread it is, but I got alarmed when I saw in the comments somebody asserting with great enthusiasm that today's classics, that is, the standard canon of classical music, represents the pop music of the past, that these were the popular favorites that have survived over the centuries. Oh, how untrue and wrong-headed that is. It's entirely false, 100% completely inane. And so I would like to sort of, tell you the way it was. The classics in our canon were never popular music, not in any way, shape, or form. It's not that there's anything wrong with popular music. It's just that the circumstances of society and music reception and performance and patronage made the very concept impossible. It didn't exist. There was no popular music. First of all, let's start with the basic proposition. There cannot be popular music as we define it today until we have mass media, because you need to be able to figure out what popular things are, what the populace is listening to and enjoying. And you can't do that unless you have radio and television and electronic reproduction of recordings and all of that stuff. Popular music did not exist until those technological advances occurred, and they didn't occur until really didn't get going until the 1920s and 30s. So that's the first and really most obvious point. It's the issue of definition. What is popular music? Today, popular music is what is genuinely popular to the extent we can measure it, and we can measure it because everybody has equal access. That's the key, equal access to musical production. And so we have popular music. And then the relationship between popular and classical music in the modern era, meaning, through most of the 20th century, is very different from the relationship between popular and classical music way back when. So let's talk a little bit about way back when, really until the First World War. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. Before then, you were born into a certain class in society, and that was it for your life. If you were a member of the aristocracy, you were a member of the aristocracy by birth. If you were a member of the working class populace, well, that's what you were. The peasantry was the peasantry. The middle class was the middle class. And the only real means by which you could sort of switch between one or the other in terms of your taste and artistic cultivation was if you entered the church, because the church was the main disseminator of what you might call popular music. Everybody went there. Everyone heard the same thing when they were in church. Although the wealthy, of course, had private chapels and private churches. But basically speaking, that was society. You were either a member of the aristocracy, the clergy, or not. That's it. Now, this obviously affected how music was created and consumed. It had the class that you were born into had nothing to do with your intelligence or your talent or your ability, but your ability to make a living depended on securing aristocratic patronage, or later in the 19th century, working for a municipality, because the nascent middle classes, who were starting to amass their own fund of wealth, wanted to enjoy the same elevated level of culture as the aristocrats, and so they paid for it. And they hired the same people the aristocracy did. Bach either worked for a princely court or a royal court of some type, or he was a municipal employee for much of his life. His son, C.P.E. Bach, was almost entirely a municipal employee. He worked for Frederick the Great, then he worked for the city of Hamburg, basically. That's how it worked. And that's who you were. And the music that you wrote was, if you worked for a town, was for the churches. And nobody ever has considered, your latest cantata or mass setting to be popular music, ever. And it wasn't. Now, but let's talk about sort of the music that this person was referring to, which is like, Beethoven symphonies and things like that. They were never popular music. First of all, Beethoven only heard them, let's forget whether he was deaf or not. He presented them a couple times in his life, and he couldn't have presented them to more than a few hundred people each time. And that was it. That was the entire audience for most of what we consider to be the greatest classics ever. A few hundred people a couple times in their lives. Haydn's London symphonies, which were wildly popular, we say. They were popular because they sold tickets. People went to see them, but 800 people maybe saw one once, maybe twice. Maybe after Haydn died and they still occasionally did one, they'd see one once or twice. That's not popular music. It couldn't be by its very definition. The Paris Conservatory Orchestra, the Orchestre de Concert du Conservatoire de Paris, or whatever it was called, Association de Concert du Conservatoire de Paris, was founded by Francois Habeneck in the late 1820s, specifically to perform Beethoven symphonies. For most of the first few decades of its career, its entire season consisted of a dozen concerts with a Beethoven symphony on most of them. So somebody, if you lived in Paris and had means, that is money, you could go see a Beethoven symphony maybe once or twice or three times in your lifetime, or every few years. That is not popular music. Popular music, as we understand it, is music that's enjoyed by like normal people who are not members of the aristocracy or some sort of hoity-toity little clique. And that kind of popular music was entirely amateur. It was songs and dances of country folk. Some of those songs and dances were quoted by the great composers who were, of course, members of that class. Haydn quoted them. Beethoven quoted them. They did. They cited some of these songs, but and some of them may have been very popular, but they weren't popular when they got quoted. They were popular before then. Going way back, if you want, to the Middle Ages, and whenever you talk about troubadours, there were popular songs. There was L'Homme Armé, one of the most popular songs of the 15th century. That song was very popular. It was so popular that it was quoted in like a bazillion mass settings by various composers. But the polyphonic mass setting that quotes the song in long notes in the tenor where you can't even hear it was not popular music. The song itself was popular, but who was it popular with? It was popular with aristocrats, with a teeny, 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 tiny percentage of society. That teeny, tiny percentage of society that essentially controlled the land, the wealth, everything in the country. And what they didn't control, the church did. So it's absolutely absurd to maintain that any of this stuff was popular music. It really sort of freaked me out to see that, because it's just such a terrible misconception. It's not because it couldn't be popular, it's because the means weren't there. The possibility didn't even exist for something to be genuinely popular as we understand it today. What we are enjoying, and what the people who consumed the great classics of the past thought about it, was that it was superior entertainment. It was high-end entertainment. Why was it high-end? Because it was expensive. It cost a lot of money to produce. You had to have your own personal orchestra. And, you'd have to have rich friends and a beautiful ballroom to present it. It was expensive, and it was the result of a class that had lots of leisure time, which most people didn't have. Most people were struggling to survive. Leisure time happened on the Sabbath, on religious feast days, on holidays and things like that. But the aristocracy had time to indulge their enjoyment of the finer things in life. That's not popular music. Not by any stretch of the imagination is that popular music. It was entertainment, but it was not popular entertainment. And we today are the beneficiaries of their taste, their culture, their perspicacity in selecting the best from among the peasant class of composers and artisans and architects and builders and everybody else who worked for them to design fabulous things that reflected, theoretically, their own superior taste and wonderfulness. That's how this stuff got there. And if you have an objection to, its aristocratic origins, well, that's too damn bad because that's just the way it was. And that's one of the reasons why the entire concept of classical music today is so difficult for some people to wrap their brains around. The idea that, it's supposed to be high art on the one hand, but entertainment on the other. And that this high art was produced by, people who were generally badly educated members of the lower classes. That's who they all were. Beethoven, Haydn, Mozart, that's who they were. Bach, the whole crowd, some of them went to university. Bach wanted his kids to go to college and become lawyers and doctors. He wanted them to join the middle class. That was the best you could do in those days. But that's what they were. And they were produced for people who we would have found probably pretty odious. Lazy, stupid, snotty aristocrats who were enjoying the privileges of birth. And that was it. That's how they got where they were. They didn't have to lift a finger. I mean, technically, the aristocracy were soldiers. I mean, their real job was defense of the realm, defense of their own holdings, their own lands, and all the people attached to those lands. That's what they did. So they did spend a good amount of time fighting each other and fighting wars and fighting other people and killing and doing all that stuff. But that's not something for which I think they would receive a lot of credit and admiration today. I mean, really, that was their job. To the extent they had a job, that was their job. The rest of it, music was made domestically. That's what happened. People, amateurs of various ability, played musical instruments, and it could be that a piano or small chamber ensemble reduction of a major symphony sold lots and lots of copies, which in those days meant like 50 or 100. I mean, if you look at C.P.E. Bach, he made a living selling his own music, which was virtually unheard of in the day. And he arranged publication of his Kenner and Liebhaber piano series, for example, through Breitkopf von Hertel, and sold them. But who did he sell them to? He sold them to wealthy members of the middle class, and he sold a few hundred exemplars of each. And that was a successful print run. And you could make a living if you did enough of it. And he did. He did enough of it. But was it popular? He did write some reasonably popular songs. They were all sacred songs. And they sold pretty well among middle class people who had musical instruments in their homes and who had the ability to perform them for each other in small groups. But how many people knew them? How many people did that? I mean, come on. The vast majority of humanity, the 99% that determines today what constitutes popular music, had no voice at all in the creation of major cultural products. They were just there, but they didn't participate in the process which created the classics that we know and love today. And that's the way it was. So let's be perfectly clear about that. I hope that this will put to bed this crazy notion that classics were pop music of their day at one point or another. Total insanity. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me. Take care.